May 12, 1943. The shimmering blue expanse of the Solomon Sea stretched beneath Lieutenant Saburo Sakai's A6M0 as he led his squadron on what should have been a routine patrol near New Georgia. The morning sun glinted off his cockpit canopy, and the air was unusually clear. Perfect hunting conditions for the Imperial Japanese Navy's most decorated ace pilot, with 64 confirmed kills. Sakai smiled with confidence, certain that any American aircraft encountered today would meet the same fate as dozens before. He had no way of knowing that this patrol would forever change his understanding of aerial warfare in the Pacific. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how Japan's finest pilots came face to face with a technological reality that would shatter their confidence and transform their understanding of modern warfare. A tale of how the P-38 Lightning revealed the stark limitations of Japanese aviation and foreshadowed the inevitable collapse of Japan's air superiority in the Pacific. Captain Taro Nakamura scanned the horizon from the cockpit of his Zero, flying in tight formation with Sakai's squadron. At 31, Nakamura was older than most pilots, a veteran of the China campaign and the early Pacific victories. His weathered face bore the confidence of a man who had survived when many others had fallen. As second in command of the squadron, he maintained radio discipline but kept a careful eye on the younger pilots flanking him. Clear skies make for good hunting. Sakai's voice crackled through the radio. Remember, maintain altitude advantage whenever possible. The Americans have numbers, but we have superior maneuverability. Understood, Lieutenant, Nakamura replied, adjusting his oxygen mask. The squadron's 8 Zeros continued their patrol pattern at 23,000 feet, their Nakajima Sake 21 engines purring smoothly in the thin air. Half a world away from the tropical Pacific, at the Lockheed plant in Burbank, California, production lines were operating around the clock. Factory manager Harold Collins surveyed the massive assembly floor where P-38 Lightnings were taking shape at an astonishing pace. In April 1943 alone, Lockheed had delivered 222 P-38s to the Army Air Forces, with production rates increasing monthly. The twin-boomed fighter represented American industrial might in its purest form. How many are we shipping to the Pacific this month? Collins asked his production supervisor. 117, came the reply. 5th Air Force is getting priority now that Kenny's boys are pushing in New Guinea. Collins nodded approvingly. Each P-38G rolling off the line carried two 1,475 horsepower Allison V-1710 engines, giving it a top speed of 414 miles per hour at altitude, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Zero. Its armament of 120mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns concentrated in the nose made it a devastating weapon platform. The Americans were shipping industrial death to the Pacific, and the Japanese had no equivalent response. Back over the Solomon Sea, Petty Officer Hiroshi Tanaka, the youngest pilot in Sakai's squadron at just 19 years old, fidgeted in his cockpit. Unlike his commanders, Tanaka had completed only 120 flight hours before being deployed to combat. The Imperial Navy's training program had been drastically shortened as losses mounted and fuel restrictions tightened. Lieutenant Sakai, Tanaka called over the radio. I think I see something at 10 o'clock, just below that cloud bank. Sakai banked slightly, focusing his experienced eyes on the indicated sector. His stomach tightened as he recognized the distinctive silhouette, twin-tail booms, a central nacelle, the unmistakable form of the aircraft Japanese pilots had come to call 2 planes, 1 pilot. P-38s, he announced calmly. 4 of them, heading northeast. They appear to be a reconnaissance flight. He paused, considering the tactical situation. They haven't seen us yet. We have the altitude advantage. We'll dive from the sun and hit them before they know we're here. The Zeros banked in unison, positioning themselves for the attack. What Sakai couldn't know was that the P-38 formation was led by Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, 5th Air Force, one of the first American aces in the Pacific with 8 confirmed kills. Lynch was flying the P-38G-10 he had named Itsy Bitsy, a machine he understood intimately. In his cockpit, Lynch was monitoring his twin Allison engines with the focus of a surgeon. The P-38's cockpit was spacious compared to most fighters, with a complex array of instruments controlling the twin power plants. Each engine consumed 100 gallons of fuel per hour at cruise settings, a thirst unimaginable to Japanese pilots who operated under severe fuel restrictions. "Lightning lead to flight. Let's climb another 1,000 feet," Lynch instructed. "The report mentioned Zeros patrolling this sector, and I'd rather have the altitude if we run into them." As the P-38s began their climb, Lynch's wingman Lieutenant David Johnson suddenly called out, "Bandits! Hi, at 2 o'clock, diving." Lynch's reaction was immediate. "Brake right, max power, drop tanks now." The four P-38s jettisoned their external fuel tanks and split into fighting pairs, the powerful Allisons roaring as they advanced to combat power settings. What should have been a perfect ambush was about to demonstrate the changing reality of air combat in the Pacific. Sakai led the diving attack, his Zero screaming downward with lethal grace. He had positioned himself perfectly to drop onto the trailing P-38, his gun sight steady on the American fighter. At this moment, he was still the embodiment of Japanese air superiority, a master pilot in what had been the most feared fighter in the Pacific during 1942. The Zero's 7.7mm machine guns chattered as Sakai opened fire at 300 yards, tracers reaching for the American aircraft. Some rounds struck the P-38's left boom, but then something happened that contradicted everything Sakai knew about air combat dynamics. Instead of continuing in a predictable path or attempting a turning fight where the Zero would dominate, the P-38 simply pulled its nose up slightly and accelerated. Not turned. Accelerated. The American fighter's twin Allison engines, each producing nearly twice the horsepower of the Zero's single Nakajima Sakai, hurled the P-38 forward with shocking speed. The distance between the fighters, which should have been closing, began to widen. "Stay with them," Sakai ordered, pushing his Zero to its limits. The airframe shuddered as he approached 360 miles per hour in his dive, nearing the aircraft's structural limitations. Yet the P-38 continued to pull away, leveling off and accelerating horizontally in a maneuver no Japanese fighter could match. Nakamura, pursuing another P-38, encountered the same shocking reality. His target simply firewalked its throttles and outran his Zero in a straight line, a tactical option that had never been available to American pilots in earlier engagements. The mathematical truth was inescapable. The Zero's top speed of 331 miles per hour was no match for the P-38G's 414 miles per hour. Lynch, now fully aware of the Japanese attack, keyed his radio. "They want to turn and burn. Don't give it to them. Use your speed. Maintain energy, boom, and zoom only." The P-38 pilots followed their commander's instructions perfectly, refusing to engage in turning fights where the Zero excelled. Instead, they used their superior speed to extend away, climb, then return for diving firing passes, a tactic that exploited American industrial and technological advantages while neutralizing Japanese piloting skills. Young Tanaka found himself desperately trying to pursue a P-38 that seemed to be toying with him. Each time he attempted to close the distance, the American fighter would simply accelerate away, climbing into another attack position. It was his first encounter with an enemy that couldn't be caught, couldn't be cornered, a fundamentally different experience from everything his instructors had taught him. "I can't catch him." Tanaka's frustrated voice crackled over the radio. "He's too fast. Break off and climb," Sakai ordered, recognizing the futility of the chase. "Reform at 25,000 feet. As the Japanese pilots regrouped, the strategic implications of what they'd witnessed began to sink in. It wasn't just about this single engagement. It was about the future of the air war. If American fighters could dictate when and how combat occurred, then all the skill and spirit of Japanese pilots might not be enough to overcome the widening technological gap. At the same time, in the American formation, Lynch was explaining to his pilots why they needed to respect the Zero despite their technical advantages. "They can still kill you if you get slow and try to turn with them," he cautioned. "Their turn radius is about half of ours. but they can't touch us if we keep our speed up. Remember, we're flying a hot rod, they're flying kites. Back at the Japanese base on Rabaul, Sakai's squadron landed with no losses, but also no victories, an increasingly common outcome as 1943 progressed. The debriefing that followed revealed the psychological impact of confronting an enemy that could simply refuse combat at will. Commander Minoru Jinda, the tactical genius who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, listened intently to Sakai's report. At 39, Jinda was already sensing the shifting tide of the air war. The lean, scholarly officer had spent years studying air power theory and understood exactly what Sakai's encounter signified. The Americans are deploying fighters that can outrun, outclimb, and outgun our best aircraft, Jinda observed quietly. And they're building them faster than we can shoot them down. The statistics supported Jinda's assessment. In 1943, Japan would produce approximately 8,600 military aircraft of all types. During the same year, American factories would roll out nearly 86,000. The Zero, essentially the same design that had shocked the Allies in 1941, was now facing newer American designs with dramatically improved performance. The P-38 in particular represented everything Japan couldn't match. It required large amounts of aluminum, massive fuel supplies, and complex manufacturing techniques that were beyond Japan's industrial capability. "What about the new fighters we've been promised?" asked Nakamura. "The J-2M Raiden and the N-1K Shurden?" Jinda's expression was grim. "Still in development, with production delays. And neither will match the P-38's speed or high-altitude performance when they do arrive. We're fighting the last war with last war's tools." For Petty Officer Tanaka, the debriefing was transformative. His training had emphasized the superiority of Japanese pilots and equipment, the spiritual advantages that would overcome any material shortcomings. Now he was confronting the harsh reality that spirit alone couldn't catch a fighter that was 80 miles per hour faster than his own. "Respectfully, Commander," Tanaka asked, "how are we supposed to fight an enemy we cannot catch?" The room fell silent. It was the question hanging over the entire Japanese Naval Air Force, one that had no satisfactory answer. "We adapt," Sakai finally replied. "We must be smarter, more disciplined. We use terrain and clouds for concealment. We work in larger formations. We choose our battles more carefully." But even as he spoke, Sakai knew they were simply tactical adjustments in the face of a strategic problem. The fundamental equation of modern warfare was working against Japan, and the P-38 was just one manifestation of this larger truth. The next morning, at the American Air Base at Port Moresby, Major Lynch conducted his own debriefing. The contrast with the Japanese discussion could not have been starker. While Sakai's pilots contemplated how to fight with inferior equipment, Lynch's squadron was focused on how to maximize their technical advantages. "The Zero still has better low-speed handling and can outmaneuver us in a turning fight," Lynch explained to his pilots, including several replacements who had just arrived from the States. "But we're faster, we can outdive them. We have better high-altitude performance, and we have significantly greater firepower." Technical Sergeant Ray Williams, the squadron's chief mechanic, added concrete details that illustrated the disparities. "Each of your planes has two 1,475 horsepower engines. That's nearly 3,000 horsepower total. A Zero has a single engine producing about 1,130 horsepower. You've got almost triple their power." "What about armament?" asked one of the new pilots. "No comparison," Williams replied. "You're carrying one 20mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns, all concentrated in the nose for maximum punch and accuracy. The Zero has two 7.7mm machine guns, equivalent to our .30 caliber, and two 20mm cannon in the wings. Our 50s can punch through their armor at 1,000 yards. Their 7.7s might not penetrate our armor at all." The statistical gulf extended to every aspect of the aircraft. The P-38 weighed 17,500 pounds fully loaded, nearly 3 times the Zero's 6,164 pounds. It carried self-sealing fuel tanks and pilot armor. The Zero sacrificed both for range and maneuverability. The American fighter could absorb significant damage and still return home. A few well-placed rounds could send a Zero down in flames. Remember, Lynch concluded, they're training new pilots with less than 120 hours of flight time now. You all have at least 400 hours before you even got here. We have better planes, better training, more fuel for practice, and soon we'll have more experience too. Don't squander these advantages by fighting on their terms. 2 weeks after the initial encounter, Sakai's squadron was again on patrol, this time escorting a vital transport mission delivering replacement pilots to Bougainville. The squadron had been reduced to 6 operational Zeros. Maintenance issues had grounded 2 aircraft due to lack of spare parts. The transport, a G-4M Betty bomber converted for passenger use, lumbered along at 230 miles per hour, forcing the Zeros to fly well below their optimal cruise speed. This speed limitation made the formation particularly vulnerable, a fact that weighed heavily on Sakai's mind as they flew through scattered clouds. Tanaka had been unusually quiet during the mission briefing. The young pilot had been visibly changed by the encounter with the P-38s, his previously boundless confidence replaced by a more sober assessment of their tactical situation. "Lieutenant," Tanaka finally called over the radio, "there's something I've been considering about our last encounter with the P-38s." "Go ahead," Sakai replied. "Their speed advantage means they can choose when to engage and when to disengage. But that works both ways. They can only engage briefly before their momentum carries them past us. If we can force them to make multiple passes." Sakai considered this. "You're suggesting we use their speed against them?" "Yes, sir. They must slow down eventually to line up accurate shots. That transitional moment is when they're vulnerable." It was sound tactical thinking, and Sakai was impressed with the young pilot's analysis. "That's good, Tanaka. We'll implement that approach if—" Sakai never finished his sentence. From high above, 8 P-38 Lightnings dove through a gap in the clouds, their tremendous speed allowing them to cross from visibility to firing range in seconds. This wasn't Lynch's squadron, but rather one from the 475th Fighter Group, the recently formed unit that would soon become known as Satan's Angels. Leading the American formation was Captain Thomas McGuire in his P-38H he'd named Pudgy, a newer model with even more powerful engines and improved high-altitude performance. McGuire would eventually become the second highest-scoring American ace of the war with 38 confirmed kills, but on this day in mid-1943, he was still building his reputation. "Lightning flight, target the escort first, then we'll deal with the transport," McGuire ordered. "Hit and run, don't get slow." The P-38s split into pairs and attacked from multiple angles, their combined firepower overwhelming. Unlike the previous encounter where the Americans had been surprised initially, this was a perfectly executed ambush. The concentrated nose-mounted guns of the P-38s created devastating cone-shaped patterns of fire, quite different from the converging fire of wing-mounted weapons. Sakai immediately recognized the threat. "Break formation. Protect the transport." The Zero pilots scattered, attempting to position themselves between the Americans and the vulnerable transport. But the speed differential was simply too great. The P-38 screamed through the Japanese formation, their combined firepower striking Petty Officer Isoroku Masuda's Zero. The American .50 caliber rounds easily penetrated the Zero's unarmored fuel tank, and Masuda's aircraft erupted into a fireball with no chance for the pilot to escape. As the Americans extended away from the engagement to set up another pass, Nakamura attempted to pursue one of the P-38s, pushing his Zero to its absolute limit. For a brief moment, as the American fighter slowed to turn, Nakamura closed the distance enough to open fire. His 20mm cannon shell struck the P-38's right engine, sending dark smoke trailing behind the American fighter. "I've hit one," Nakamura called out. But his momentary success was short-lived. Even with one damaged engine, the P-38 still outpaced the Zero. The American pilot feathered his right propeller, adjusted his throttle and rudder trim to compensate for asymmetric thrust, and continued flying on his remaining engine, another advantage of the twin-engine design that no Japanese fighter could match. Sakai witnessed this with mounting frustration. The damaged American fighter was escaping on a single engine, still flying faster than his Zero at full power. It was a perfect encapsulation of the technological disparity reshaping the air war. The P-38s regrouped and made another coordinated attack, this time focusing on the transport. The Betty had no chance against such overwhelming firepower. Multiple .50 caliber rounds and 20mm shells tore through its minimal armor, and the transport began losing altitude with its right wing ablaze. "Stay with the transport," Sakai ordered, diving to follow the stricken aircraft. As he descended, he saw several figures bail out. At least some of the replacement pilots might survive. But the Betty itself was doomed, crashing into the jungle-covered mountains of Bougainville with a final explosion that sent a black mushroom cloud rising above the canopy. When the battle ended, Sakai's squadron had lost 2 Zeros and failed to protect their transport. The Americans had lost none, though one P-38 was returning to base on a single engine. The exchange ratio was becoming typical of Pacific air combat by mid-1943, a stark contrast to the early war period when Japanese pilots had enjoyed technical parity or advantage. Back at Rabaul, the psychological impact of this latest defeat was profound. Commander Jinda called a special briefing for all pilots, recognizing that morale was deteriorating as rapidly as their aircraft strength. "We must address the reality of our situation," Jinda began, standing before a map of the Pacific theater marked with American advances. "The P-38 Lightning represents a fundamental challenge to our air defense strategy. It can escort American bombers to targets we previously considered safe due to distance. It can outrun our interceptors, and it is arriving in increasing numbers." He displayed a graph showing comparative aircraft production between Japan and the United States. The lines diverged so dramatically that by 1943, American production exceeded Japanese by a factor of 10. Even more concerning was a second chart showing aviation fuel production, where the disparity was even greater. America produced 6 billion gallons of aviation fuel last year, Jinda continued. Our entire national reserve is approximately 7 million barrels. The tactical implications are clear. American pilots receive 3 times the training hours of our replacement pilots. They can practice formation flying, gunnery, and combat maneuvers while we must conserve fuel for combat operations only. The room was silent as the statistical reality of modern industrial warfare sank in. For pilots trained to believe in the Bushido spirit and the inherent superiority of Japanese airmen, these production figures were more threatening than any enemy fighter. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, a veteran Zero pilot with multiple victories, finally spoke up. "With respect, Commander, what are we supposed to do with this information? Should we simply accept defeat because American factories produce more aircraft?" Jinda shook his head. "No, but we must adapt our tactics and expectations to our strategic reality. We can no longer afford to lose experienced pilots in unfavorable engagements. We must become more selective in our battles, more conservative in our tactics, and more focused on defense rather than offense." It was, effectively, an admission that Japan had already lost air superiority just 18 months after Pearl Harbor. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was now outclassed by newer American designs. The P-38 was just the most dramatic example of this shift, its twin-engine configuration making it visually and operationally distinct from other fighters. For young pilots like Tanaka, this new defensive mindset contradicted everything they had been taught about Japanese aerial warfare. The offensive spirit, the willingness to attack regardless of odds, had been fundamental to their training and identity as naval aviators. "Sir," Tanaka asked, "are you saying the spiritual strength of our pilots is not enough to overcome material disadvantages?" Jinda regarded the young pilot with compassion. "Spiritual strength is vital, but it cannot repeal the laws of physics. A Zero flying at 331 miles per hour cannot catch a P-38 flying at 414 miles per hour, regardless of the pilot's spirit. We must recognize this reality to survive and continue the fight." Meanwhile, at Port Moresby, the Americans were conducting a very different kind of analysis. Major General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, was reviewing the performance data from recent P-38 operations with a satisfaction that bordered on glee. "The Lightning is proving to be exactly what we needed in this theater," Kinney told his staff. "The range lets us escort bombers all the way to Rabaul. The speed lets us dictate the terms of engagement. And the concentrated firepower means our pilots need less time on target to score decisive hits." The numbers supported his assessment. P-38 pilots were achieving a 10-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese fighters by mid-1943. The twin-engine American fighter had transformed from an improved design to the dominant air superiority platform in the Pacific in less than a year. Colonel Marion C. Cooper, Kinney's operations officer and a legendary aviator in his own right, added context to the statistics. "It's not just the P-38's performance that matters. It's what that performance represents psychologically. The Japanese pilot who cannot catch his enemy experiences a fundamental shift in his combat mentality. He is no longer the hunter, but the hunted." This psychological dimension became increasingly evident as 1943 progressed. Japanese pilots began avoiding combat when P-38s were present, preferring to engage single-engine American fighters where they still held some maneuverability advantages. But even this selective approach was becoming less viable as newer American designs like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair entered service with performance characteristics that also outclassed the Zero. By September 1943, Lieutenant Sakai had been transferred to a training role, his experience too valuable to risk in the increasingly one-sided air battles over the Solomon Islands. Before leaving the front lines, he documented his observations for the next generation of pilots, his combat diary becoming a valuable resource for understanding the psychological impact of technological inferiority. "The P-38 Lightning changed the nature of air combat in the Pacific," Sakai wrote. "Before its arrival, we could engage or disengage at will, confident in our superior maneuverability. The Lightning removed this advantage entirely. An enemy who cannot be caught cannot be defeated. An enemy who can choose when and where to fight will always hold the initiative." For Petty Officer Tanaka, these lessons came too late. In October 1943, his squadron intercepted a formation of B-24 bombers escorted by P-38s near Rabaul. Diving from above, Tanaka managed to damage one bomber before being targeted by a P-38 flown by Lieutenant Richard Bong, the man who would become America's highest-scoring ace with 40 confirmed victories. Tanaka attempted to evade using the Zero's superior turning capability, but Bong refused to engage in a turning fight. Instead, he used his P-38's speed to extend away, climb, and return in a diving attack. The concentrated fire from the Lightning's nose-mounted weapons struck Tanaka's Zero directly in the cockpit. He was killed instantly, his aircraft spiraling into the Solomon Sea with no attempt to bail out. When news of Tanaka's death reached Commander Jinda, he added another name to the growing list of experienced pilots lost to superior American technology. The average combat life expectancy of a Japanese pilot was decreasing monthly as veteran airmen were lost and replaced by inadequately trained novices. By late 1943, new Japanese pilots had an average of only 100 flight hours before entering combat. Their American counterparts typically had over 400 hours. In California, the Lockheed production lines continued to accelerate. By the end of 1943, they were producing 250 P-38s monthly, with improved models featuring water injection systems that further increased engine performance. The industrial might of America was delivering technological superiority in quantities that Japan could not match, let alone exceed. The strategic implications extended beyond individual dogfights or even air superiority. The P-38's speed, range, and altitude performance made it the perfect platform for long-range fighter escorts, allowing American bombers to strike targets previously considered safe from air attack. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was profound. Nowhere in their empire was truly secure from American air power. By early 1944, the air war in the Pacific had transformed completely. American technological superiority, exemplified by aircraft like the P-38 Lightning, had rendered Japanese aerial tactics obsolete. The Zero, once the most feared fighter in the Pacific, had become vulnerable prey, unable to dictate the terms of engagement or escape when outnumbered. For the Japanese pilots who survived this transition, the psychological adjustment was perhaps the most difficult aspect. They had entered the war believing in their superior training, tactics, and fighting spirit. They had ended it unable to even catch their enemies in level flight, reduced to defensive desperation against an opponent with overwhelming material and increasingly comparable skill advantages. In his post-war memoirs, Saburo Sakai reflected on this transformation. The arrival of the P-38 Lightning was the moment we first understood we could not win the air war. When your opponent can choose whether to fight or not based solely on his technical advantages, no amount of skill or courage can overcome the disparity. The Lightning showed us the future of air combat, a future where industrial capacity would matter more than individual pilot skill. The story of the P-38 Lightning versus the Zero encapsulates the broader narrative of the Pacific War, a conflict that began with Japanese tactical brilliance overcoming material disadvantages but ended with American industrial might producing weapons in such quantities and of such quality that no amount of skill or sacrifice could compensate. For Japan's pilots, the inability to outrun the P-38 Lightning became a metaphor for their nation's larger strategic predicament. They were trapped in a war they could not win against an enemy they could not match, producing planes they could not catch, piloted by aviators they could no longer outfight. It was a lesson written in contrails across the Pacific sky, paid for in the lives of an entire generation of Japanese naval aviators. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.